Depressions are not something that are necessarily neat and tidy, number one. At least in the United States, the way economists have viewed it, we had something called the Long Depression. It lasted from roughly 1870 to 1898 in the United States. Now, it doesn't mean that every single year output went down and they didn't even keep the records we keep today, and there are a lot of things that are different, but it's known as the Long Depression. Number two, just to be a little bit technical for a second, a recession is conventionally defined as 2 or more consecutive quarters of declining GDP. There's a little more to it than that, but if you get 2 quarters of declining GDP, consecutive, that's a recession. And then we have a formal body here in the United States, the National Bureau of Economic Research. They date them. I think other countries have the same thing. I think Australia set a record for developed economies for the longest time without a recession, using that definition, I think 26, 27 years, if I'm not mistaken.
I wanted to start with a bigger question, really. Your big contention at the moment is that we're currently in a depression.
Right.
Can I ask you to explain that contention? Can you explain the depression contention for me, please?
I am comfortable describing where we're heading, what we're heading into right now as a new depression. But I said the same thing in 2010, and I can take that entire thread from 2010 to 2021 and beyond and call it a depression. I'll explain why. Depressions are not something that are necessarily neat and tidy, number one. At least in the United States, the way economists have viewed it, we had something called the Long Depression. It lasted from roughly 1870 to 1898 in the United States. Now, it doesn't mean that every single year output went down and they didn't even keep the records we keep today, and there are a lot of things that are different, but it's known as the Long Depression. Number two, just to be a little bit technical for a second, a recession is conventionally defined as 2 or more consecutive quarters of declining GDP. There's a little more to it than that, but if you get 2 quarters of declining GDP, consecutive, that's a recession. And then we have a formal body here in the United States, the National Bureau of Economic Research. They date them. I think other countries have the same thing. I think Australia set a record for developed economies for the longest time without a recession, using that definition, I think 26, 27 years, if I'm not mistaken. A depression, people say, well, gee, a depression sounds worse than a recession. So if recession is 2 quarters, well, a depression, that must be 5 quarters or 7 quarters or 10 quarters, something, extreme. And that's not the definition of a recession. You can have growth in a depression. You can have rising stock markets in a depression. The name depression comes from the fact that you have depressed growth. In other words, the growth that you have is below trend, or it's below potential. So say here's your trend line or your potential line, here's your actual growth. That gap is depressed growth. You could be growing, but you're not growing as strongly as you might or as you had in the past. Recessions come and go, and we had one at least in the United States, but really globally in 2020. The funny thing is, it was the shortest recession ever, start to finish. Now, it was kind of March and April of 2020. They said it was over by the end of April and the economy started to bounce back. And for that matter, January and even February were okay. But because March and April are in 2 different quarters, and because it was so severe, that both quarters had a drop in GDP. First quarter down around 5%, second quarter down around 31% on an annualized basis. So you had 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP, technically recession. But when they got around to dating it, they said, yeah, but it was really just March and April, just 2 months, a 2-month recession. And we came roaring back in the third quarter. So that's what a recession is, and they happened. So I would say we were in a depression from 2009 to 2019, not because we weren't growing, but because we were growing way below trend and way more slowly than the increase in the national debt. We're getting back to that right now. So again, just use the Great Depression as an example. 1929 to 1940, that's the conventional dating for the Great Depression. But there were 2 technical recessions inside. One was 1929 to 1933. The other one was 1937 and 1938, because the Fed managed to screw things up twice, in the course of one depression. And by the way, one of the longest recoveries, I think was the longest recovery in US history, fit that definition. From 2009 to the end of 2019, maybe if you throw in January 2020 for good measure. So that's over a 10-year period, close to an 11-year period. We had an expansion the whole time, but the annualized growth rate was about 2.2%. Now, the average recovery since 1980 was 3.2% annualized growth. The average recovery since the end of World War II was over 4%, closer to 4.5% annualized growth. So the 2.2% pump growth relative to a recent trend of 3.2 and a long-term trend of 4.5 and potentially even higher, because when you come out of a recession, you got to be able to grow faster than that. That's depressed growth. It's not that there can't be growth. It's not that stock markets can go up. Both of those things can be true. The point is, it's below trend growth, below potential growth. In other words, depressed growth, and you don't regain those old highs. Now, stock markets have regained those old highs. But that raises a different issue, which is, are they bubbles? Is residential real estate a bubble? Are stocks a bubble? Are crypto a bubble? Well, you'll get two sides to those debates in a heartbeat, and I don't pretend I don't want to be categorical about the answer. I have my own views, but let's not confuse asset bubbles with strong growth, because the strong growth isn't there. And in the United States, just to put a finer point on it, our best forecasting tool, none of them are perfect, but the best one most consistently is the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta has a tool called GDP Now. And they don't say they're forecasting, they say they're nowcasting. And what does that mean? Well, what they do is, the way Wall Street does it, you're in the middle of the quarters, 2 months into a quarter, which we're actually now getting closer to the end of the third quarter. And you have a certain amount of data, but there's some data you don't have. So Wall Street takes the data you've got and they extrapolate or they project the missing data based on correlations and regressions, and then that's their estimate. They're almost always wrong. Now, we had very good growth from 1933 to 1937. The problem was when unemployment's 24% and you get it down to 14%, well, that's a big improvement. You're creating a lot of jobs, but it's still 14%. And when you ask people, when you put the questions differently, you say, well, okay, the stock market hit a certain level in 1929. It then crashed. Okay, it went down over almost 90% to hit bottom in June 1932. When did it get back to the 1929 high? The answer is 1954. It took 25 years to dig itself out of that hole. By the way, the same is true for commercial real estate. It did. Now, again, it doesn't mean you couldn't make money. It doesn't mean it didn't go up, because from the bottom in June 1932, it did go up, and you could have made money in stocks in 33 and 34, but it took until 1954 to get back to the 1929 level. So that's what I mean by depression. Recession is conventionally defined as 2 or more consecutive quarters of declining GDP. You can have growth in a depression. You can have rising stock markets in a depression. The funny thing is, it was the shortest recession ever, start to finish. 1929 to 1940, that's the conventional dating for the Great Depression.